All right. We'll give just another couple of seconds for everybody to come in and settle. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to PNP Live. My name is Beth. I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose. And we thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a special midday PNP Live to celebrate Twilight of Democracy, the Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism by Applebaum. At any time during the event, you can click on the link, which I have just entered in the chat, to purchase this afternoon's book on PNP's website. A reminder that during this particularly difficult time for small businesses, your book purchases are everything that is keeping Politics and Prose going, and the doors open and the books coming. So we thank you for those, and we really encourage you to buy today's book. You can ask the author a question today by clicking on the Q&A button, which is located in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Make sure to not submit your question into the chat, but rather into that Q&A box so that our moderator and author see them. To the main event, I will waste no more time. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's the author of 3 critically acclaimed and award-winning histories of the Soviet Union, Red Famine, Iron Curtain, and Gulag, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Yascha Mounk is a writer, academic, and public speaker known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. Welcome, Anne and Yascha.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me kick off the proceedings. I mean, Anne, you know, I know and admire your work, and you know, felt that this book wouldn't tell me much that is new because I read every line you write anyway. But it's just such a wonderful book, you know, and it does something that's really, really rare, which is that it feels like, I mean, you know, the topic is serious, not particularly optimistic, but it feels like it's a pleasant beach read. You know, it feels like something you sort of swept along with in this sort of nice forward motion. But at the same time, it actually makes a number of really interesting conceptual innovations and really helps us understand the nature of this threat to democracy. And as I understand, the American, but not the British version, you call it the seductive lure of authoritarianism in a really deep way. So first of all, just congratulations on an amazing piece of work. And I do urge everybody to read the book, buy the book, spread the word about it. I think if there's a red thread through the book, it is this idea of the clerk, this idea of you know, an intellectual, a political operative who starts off with serious ideas, but sort of puts themselves in the service of authoritarianism. And this seems to be a pattern that we see from 1920s France to some of your friends in Poland, to some of the colleagues you had in various journalistic positions in the United Kingdom, to a lot of what's happened to the Republican Party here in the United States. What is a clerk? Help us understand what you mean by that concept.
So first of all, before I answer that question, I just want to say to this particular audience, this is my favorite bookstore. This is the bookstore I grew up going to. I want to echo what was said at the beginning about supporting it and buying books from it. It doesn't have to be my book, but you know, of course, that would be nice. And I really thank you, everybody, for coming in the middle of the day. It's partly to accommodate me because I'm in Europe, and if you did it in the evening, it would be the middle of the night. And so thank you for that. And also thank you for the invitation to Yascha, who is my colleague in a number of different places and ways, and who's doing interesting projects that maybe we can talk about a little bit later in the conversation that are connected to my book. So yes, Yascha pointed actually right to the central issue of the book, which is this is a book that is, well, let me say this is not a book about why people vote for Trump. It's not a book about voters. It's not a book about the mass public decisions. You know, it's not about, it's not even really a book about authoritarians themselves. It's not about Trump or Putin or Viktor Orban. It's a book about intellectuals, spin doctors, journalists, and people who work on behalf of those leaders and those movements and who seek to sell them. So there are there's a particular kind of person who's an intermediary. And this happens to be, the reason I chose this topic was entirely personal. It's because I know some of them. And I know some of them from Eastern Europe, where I've lived for many years. I know some from London, where I also worked for many years, and I know some from the United States, from years of association with other journalists, and particularly in what used to be the conservative Republican Party and has now become something else. And I started thinking about them several years back, and wondering how to explain what seemed to me their transformation. And so I started reading up on similar kinds of changes and similar kinds of political movements in the past. And one of the books I found, which I'd read years earlier, but I reread, is a book by Julian Benda called The Treason of the Clerks, La Trahison des Clercs. Sometimes it's translated as Treason of the Intellectuals. And this is a book about people who decide to use their brains and their talent instead of looking for the truth, or instead of studying history, or instead of seeking to illuminate the world, who instead align themselves with authoritarians, in the era he was writing, of the far left and the far right, with dictators, and in the modern era with illiberal political movements. And then the question is, why do people do that? Because very often these are people who start out in a different place. I mean, the ambition to be an intellectual or to be a journalist often begins with this, a lot of idealism and the desire to be, part of a democratic conversation, to have a role in a public debate. And a lot of the people that I knew in Poland, for example, in the 1990s, were people who'd fought against communism, they'd fought against dictatorship, and they were really excited now to be part of the democratic world. And so the question is, what caused them to change? Why did they decide to put their talents in the service of an illiberal government? And I explain a little bit what I mean by that. In Poland, we have now a ruling party that is, although it was democratically elected, when it came to power, it began to change the rules, seeking to change the rules so that it would stay in power, and to create a kind of, not a full one-party state, but a political system in which it would be very hard for them to lose an election. And this is now a pattern that we can see in a number of other countries, that there are these authoritarian, sometimes they're called populist movements, that take power and then try to rearrange the system so that they never leave. So the question is, why do people work for those kinds of movements? And the answer, which I was just saying to Yascha before we came on the air, is one that is very probably annoying to political scientists, to some of the reviewers of the book, which is, the answer is, it depends. There are different kinds of people, and they have different motives. And the book explores some of these different motives, and some of them are personal. There are people who, in Poland, there are people who didn't like the political system that was created in the 90s, partly because it wasn't favorable to them, and because they hadn't personally achieved something. There are people who, and maybe we'll talk about this more, who feel deep pessimism about their own societies, and begin to see authoritarianism or radical politics as a way of changing that system. There are people who are interested in power, and they think that if they attach themselves to an authoritarian, that will be one way to achieve power. So I go through these different examples and different kinds of people. Some of them I meet, some of them wouldn't talk to me, some of them I examined through their writings, and I try and explain it. As I said, it will annoy people who want a single answer and a kind of neat conclusion, because I show that there are many different kinds of people. But for me, the process of doing this, of thinking this through, and looking again at the work of people I know, was quite cathartic. It explained a lot of my own personal history to me. It explained what happened to people who used to be my friends, or else just my acquaintances and colleagues.
So, the book opens with the description of this party at your house, New Year's 2000, and based on this wonderful Atlantic article, the way in which some people who were then sort of on the same side politically, who then felt like they were part of a common enterprise, who claimed at least an allegiance to the values of liberal democracy, have then really abandoned those values. And today, many of the people in that room would not speak to each other. And many show that something similar in many ways has been happening in the United Kingdom, in Spain, in the United States, and in some other places you mentioned along the way. I know that there's not a single answer, but if there was a party like that today, in some country that perhaps hasn't quite divided like that yet, let's say Germany, where I'm from, which has more problems than outsiders sometimes think, but which hasn't been split in quite the way as Poland or the United Kingdom has in the last years. What would you tell people to look out for if you want to make the right prediction as to who ends up where? Because it seems to me you don't have one simple answer, but you do have a set of guidelines about who might be tempted to become a clerk, who might be tempted to commit this treason of the intellectuals in the way you talk about.
I would look for people who are deeply disappointed and who have become convinced that their societies are in deep trouble. And sometimes they become convinced of this for personal reasons. They are personally not successful, but sometimes it's broader than that. One of the people I talk about in the book is a very old friend of mine who died recently, who's called Roger Scruton, who's a conservative philosopher. And a couple of years ago, I picked up a book that he wrote at least a decade ago. And the book is called England, an Elegy. He's British, or he was British. And the book is really extraordinary. It's a book which he describes at the beginning as a funeral oration for my country. In other words, this is a book by someone who thinks his country is dead, gone. I mean, and he's celebrating the values of a country that no longer exists and have been replaced by a ghastly, modern, hideous state, which has no real identity, in which the cities are just burned out and hollowed out, and the countryside has been taken over by industrial farming, and it's lost its character. Roger himself was not a clerk by any means. He was a philosopher and he was not part of politics. But he did reflect something that I think was real in England. And this was a sense of that our civilization is disappearing, and something very sort of urgent and important about England is gone. And maybe they were right in a sense, that there is a kind of Victorian England, that once ruled the world that is gone, and there are a set of customs and so on connected to it that that have disappeared. And Roger was expressing the bitterness of that passing, and he was probably speaking for a lot of people, most of whom are not as articulate as Roger, but who felt that same thing. And then then there's a separate category of people who are the ones who also either felt that themselves or saw that this was, that this was a deep sentiment kind of buried in the country's psyche, and sought to manipulate it and use it. And so there were people who, when, starting out in the Tory party and then later on during the Brexit campaign, sought to appeal to people who had that fear of their country disappearing and who were nostalgic for something else. And so maybe we can then talk about a second category of a person who is a spin doctor, a person who seeks to reach out to, to create a political movement. And there were people who used this deep sentiment to do that. And if you remember, the slogan of the Brexit campaign was "Take back control." And this was a slogan that was designed to appeal to people who felt they were losing control. They were losing their country, or they were losing, technology was moving so fast, things were changing very quickly. They were losing something. And the Brexit movement falsely, actually, and dishonestly, in my view, told them that all these kinds of problems would be fixed by Brexit. In fact, Brexit fixed nothing. It didn't alter most people's lives, and if it has any economic effect, it's going to be negative, at least for the foreseeable future. So maybe those are two categories already. There's a true intellectual, actually, but who felt this deep despair, and then there's another category of person who's a kind of political entrepreneur who seeks to use the ideas to create a new political movement. And there always have been such people. I mean, new political movements and ideas come from somewhere. Somebody has the deeper thought, and then somebody else has the idea, okay, how do we organize people around this thought? What's the messages that we use? And in the modern war era, and this I also talk about a little bit, the messages are, you transmit them through social media, and it's about creating slogans and memes and pictures and a sense of kind of tribal identity around this feeling of despair. So I think those are probably in the book, those are the two most interesting categories of people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, to me, the political entrepreneur of a spin doctor is a little bit less surprising than some of these intellectuals you describe. So let me dig into the question of those intellectuals just one beat longer. The way you think about them in the book, using some of Svetlana Boym's work, is with two different kinds of nostalgia. And as I understand it, there's a kind of innocuous or perhaps even healthy form of nostalgia, which appreciates many of the things of the past, which studies it, which sort of puts it on a pedestal perhaps, but which also recognizes that it's unrealistic to re-import that past into the present. And we wouldn't want to, even if we could. And then there's a more pernicious form of nostalgia, which is implicit in Make America Great Again, but which is also implicit in many of its international versions, like the Spanish version of that you described with the Vox Party, that seems to have a harder edge, and that is actually both less rooted in the actual description of past reality and more desirous of turning back the clock on a bunch of things that we really don't want to turn the clock back on. So I guess I'd love for you to describe that distinction when nostalgia becomes dangerous, but also perhaps to say something about why it is that this more dangerous form of nostalgia is so prevalent at this point in time. We weren't talking about Make America Great Again 10 or 20 years ago in the same ways. The Spanish weren't talking about making Spain great again in the same way 10 or 20 years ago. Why is it that political movements like Vox in Spain or like Donald Trump in the United States can seize upon this nostalgia in such a powerful way right now, or in Britain with take back control?
Right. So yeah, this is a distinction I make, and actually, the book is not terribly philosophical. It's a lot of anecdotes and stories, but I do talk about a few ideas that are abstract, and one of them is this distinction between reflexive nostalgia and restorative nostalgia. So there is a difference between people who like old churches and old photo albums and old pictures, which actually I think I'm in that category, and people who actually want to recreate the past and bring it back, the way it was. And as Yascha has just said, that's what we mean by Make America Great Again. Some vision of the past, America in the 1950s, bring it back to the present. Some vision of Spain in, I'm not even sure which era they're trying to appeal to, but in the Franco era, presumably, bring that back and bring the values and morals of that time, bring those to the present. And a version of this nostalgia lies behind almost every modern nationalist project, that what we need to do is to restore the nation to the moment when it was great. And therefore, that means we need to eliminate whatever elements of modernity have sullied it or undermined it or are preventing it from being great again. And of course, this is pretty closely connected to what we were just talking about before. If you're very pessimistic and you think your society is, is dying, then maybe what you begin to do is you look back to another era when your society was great, or you think it was great, and you try to bring back that era. And the danger is that you have to explain to people why your society has gone downhill. What is the explanation for this great loss, and why do we need to bring back, I don't know, the 1950s or the 1890s? And as I said, the reason is that someone has got in the way. Someone has undermined us. Sometimes foreigners have undermined us. Immigrants have undermined us. A neighboring country who has fought with us has undermined. Someone is responsible. And the nostalgic project is invariably about getting rid of whatever is the modern problem or the people, and reverting back to some previous era. I mean, very often it's connected to people who want to reassert traditional forms of family life or traditional social hierarchies. Everything was better back when, everybody knew their place and the rich were rich and the poor were poor and there was none of this, moving around. Or everything was better when, men were men and women were women and there was none of this women going to work business and it was all simpler then. So very often it's connected to that kind of social, and very often appeals also to a particular kind of person, to a person who doesn't like change or is bothered by change or is bothered by dissonance, by the way in which society is moving quickly. But the second part of your question, which is why now, is a really interesting one. I mean, I don't have a full answer. I do think there are several things going on, and some of this is in the book and some of it isn't. I mean, partly I think it's to do with the West's sense that it's not running the world anymore, that other societies are rising. And it's not even necessarily that ours is declining, but doesn't feel like we have as much control as we used to. I think that's, there's some psychic way in which people really are affected by the status of their country. I mean, even though it's stupid, I mean, why should an ordinary American, walking down Connecticut Avenue be bothered about whether America is doing well in the world or not? I mean, it shouldn't matter, but somehow I think it's connected to our perceptions of ourselves and who we are. And some of the pessimism in America today is connected to this feeling of decline. I think it is a product of the speed of change, and especially the speed of change in information technology. The sense of, the immense amount of noise and information, and the sense all the time that we're bombarded by new things and by transformations that we can't necessarily quite keep up with. Not everybody wants to adopt the latest piece of technology or the latest, whatever it is. And people feel as if they're being left behind by something. And they become nostalgic for a simpler era. And there's and by the way, I'm not necessarily saying that that's wrong. Or that people shouldn't sometimes wish for simplicity, because there's something natural to it. I mean, all change does involve a degree of destruction or a degree of loss. And it's just a question of proportion. But I do think that the speed of change, the speed of economic change, of technological change, the loss of status of all of our countries in some sense, the awareness also of the ways in which we're now integrated into the world, which, I think is a good and positive thing. And also a lot of younger people find to be good and positive and exciting. But for a lot of people, that also feels like a threat to some essential part of their identity. Won't we lose something if we, if we're not, if we're somehow too integrated with our neighbors or too similar to other countries. So I think in a real sense, this is a real, an important and genuine psychological impact of globalization. People feel that we're losing some essence, or we're losing something because, American products are now available in every country, and Chinese food is available in small American cities. And again, for lots of people, that's a positive, an exciting change. The food is improved. But for some people, it feels like a loss, or, they're losing something essential. But I don't have I can't give you a one sentence or one word answer. But I think it is connected to change, to globalization, and to the West, America, and Europe's loss of feeling, some kind of loss of power.
Well, I think that was much better than any one sentence answer could have been. I guess I'm wondering if there's a connection between those changes and the way in which they make some people particularly afraid of the future. You describe very interesting new conversations with Karen Stanner, a scholar of authoritarianism, who talks about sort of 1/3 of the population who has authoritarian tendencies, which in moments of relatively small change, in moments when there's a feeling of unity, it may be difficult to distinguish these people from anybody else. But when change is very rapid, when they feel unsettled, when they feel that everything is cacophonous rather than there being a sense of a commonality, then the authoritarian instincts get mobilized. And these are the voters who are most likely to go, and to some extent, for all of those parties and movements you're talking about. So I wonder if there's a connection between the people who are unsettled by the change and the people who are looking for a simple answer. And the simple answer can be a politician or political movement, but it can also be something that you name the medium lie. Now, in politics, politicians lie, and we here in Washington, D.C. are well aware of that. There's nothing particularly surprising about a politician lying about some financial misdealing or some affair, or simply having said something unpopular in the past. We also know that there are some totalitarian regimes that really want to instill a whole worldview in their subjects, which is connected and overarching. And I take it that you think the way that misinformation works today is neither on one side of this nor on the other. It goes well beyond, no, I didn't embezzle those $2,000. But it also is in the kind of totalitarian ideology that you chronicled so well in your other books in the Soviet Union and Central Europe and so on. So what is this medium lie?
So in the book, I talk about how conspiracy theories function in politics and how people cynically use them, basically. And I underline how this works. And I suppose the contrast is, in the past, in the 20th century, authoritarian regimes created big lies, very elaborate ideologies that everybody had to adhere to. And everybody had to believe very false things about the world. If you were in the Soviet Union, you had to believe that whatever, the harvest was 1,000% above the expected norm, and everybody was happy, and everyone, there were smiling people on posters, and that's what life was like, and you were expected to somehow go along with this big lie. These modern authoritarian political parties that have emerged in democracies don't necessarily need these big lies, and they don't have big ideologies that require people to, believe completely false things about their lives. But they do often rely on some pieces of falsehood. The best example, since there are a lot of Americans on this call, on this event, the best example in the United States is birtherism. So birtherism, as you remember, was the theory that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president, that he was fake, he wasn't really American, he was born in Kenya, and he was illegally president. Sometimes he was Muslim or other things, but essentially he was, something like 25% of Americans believed that conspiracy theory, which was much underestimated and underrated at the time. But if you think about what that means that 25% of Americans believed that the entire state, the bureaucracy, the FBI, the CIA, the media were all lying and keeping in place this fake and illegitimate president. And if and it is not an accident, by the way, that Donald Trump was a prime leader and a big spokesman for the birtherist movement, because once you can convince people of that, and again, you didn't have to convince them that black is white or the sky is falling or but if you convince them that the American president, a huge scam has taken place and we have a fake president, if you can convince them of that, then you can begin to create a kind of, I would call almost like a community of distrust. So lots of, a large group of people who distrust institutions, who don't believe in them, who think they're being lied to all the time, and who organize themselves around this conspiracy theory. And this is something that absolutely happened in the United States. It's also something that happened in Poland, where the conspiracy theory was different. It was to do with a plane crash that killed the former president of Poland 10 years ago. And again, theories about why that was, and it had been covered up. And really the Russians or maybe the Polish government at the time were responsible. But the illiberal ruling party, Law and Justice, convinced people that this was true. And once it had them organized around that false story, then it was that much easier to to unseat the rest of the political system and to undo it. Because again, if people believe that the establishment is lying and has helped to kill the president, then they're capable of believing a lot of other things. In my book, I tell these stories because I know some of the people who were primarily responsible for writing up and selling and propagating and, creating stories about these conspiracy theories. And so I try talking to one or two of them, and I describe others. But this is actually this is now a political technique. You can organize people around these false stories, and it's sufficient. You don't need communism. You don't need a big theory of, history and, and all of society. You just need to organize people around these theories. So that's I think how it functions in modern politics.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I encourage everybody to read the book, because as Anne was saying earlier, sort of this conversation is quite conceptual, because that's the easiest thing but to convey, in a discussion about a book. But just the stories of these people, and how it has become to propagate this medium lie, how it is that works on the ground, are just so plastic and sometimes scary and sometimes moving in the book, that I don't think we can do justice to it in this conversation. So please do read the book. I want to take a few questions from the audience, and then
actually wait, Yascha, before you do that, I wanted to say one other thing, which is that you were right to focus, because I wanted to just say one thing about what you're doing. You were right to focus on this desire for simplicity and this desire for easy solutions that people now have. And I wanted to just tout for a second, one of the challenges of the modern moment for American liberals and people who believe in American liberal democracy is how to preserve complexity. In other words, how do we make sure that we don't fall into a trap of wanting, one simple answer to all of our questions, either on the right or on the left? And that's why Yascha has recently started a project called Persuasion, which is both a sort of a new magazine, but also a kind of political conversation group. Which the idea of which is to, focus again on what are liberal values and how do we preserve complicated conversations? How do we, keep, nuanced ideas in our heads all at the same time? And that's, by the way, that's where my book sort of ends, with a call for more conversation like this and more, a nuanced and non-simplistic view of the world. But anyway, happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you so much for that shout out. That's very kind of you. And it's true that I think what we're trying to do at Persuasion is very related to the concerns of this book. It's also related to one of the questions that I'm going to pose to you, because what we're seeing at the moment in my mind, and I believe your mind, is that populism, and often right-wing populism, are the most urgent threats to liberal democracy, but there's also a growing temptation on parts of the left to abandon some of the values and principles of a free society. So Joe and Wolf asks, seem to be accounting for right-wing authoritarianism. What drives intellectuals or clerks to support left-wing authoritarianism? Is that essentially the same set of mechanisms, or is there something else going on in people, whether it is the clerks who support regimes like in Venezuela, or perhaps even some of the people within Western democracies who are saying we should give up on basic values like due process or freedom of speech and so on?
So it depends what we're talking about. I mean, I think that the mechanisms of left-wing sort of authoritarian populism are actually not that different from right-wing authoritarian populism. I was myself in Venezuela in February, just before we all stopped traveling. And one of the most striking things about it is how similar the mechanisms were. In other words, Hugo Chavez came to power saying, I represent the real Venezuela, the true Venezuela. And I want to bring back the glory days of Simon Bolivar and recreate the Bolivarian Republic. In other words, he was using a lot of language and kind of the tactics that are used by right-wing authoritarian populists in the West, except that he then added this some nutty economic theories on top of it that have caused led the country into real disaster. But some of the ways of thinking aren't that different. Look, in the U.S., if since we're going into this conversation, there is a difference between there isn't a liberal tendency on the left in the United States. There is a you see it in universities. You now see it in some parts of the media. There is an increasingly strict rules about what you are and aren't allowed to say. There are people who organize kind of, Twitter mobs, instead of, we don't have street mobs, but we have Twitter mobs that are used to silence people or to get them fired. There's fear, at the level of editors and university administrators who are afraid of groups like that. And that has had a kind of chilling effect on conversation in some places. I mean, maybe in the future, after Donald Trump is gone, I too will be worried enough about those things to focus on them. At the moment, I mean, first of all, my experience and my, sorry, there's an airplane outside. My experience and my, my life was spent on the center right and knowing people on the right. And so that was the subject that I felt most able to write about. And it's also pretty clear to me that having Trump in charge of the government, and having all the mechanisms of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy at his power makes him far more dangerous to democracy and to many other things than the left is right now. So to me, that's the more urgent problem. But does that mean that there's no such thing as left-wing authoritarianism? Of course not. I mean, I spent most of my life writing books about it. I mean, I wrote 3 books about Soviet communism, one about the Gulag, one about the Ukrainian famine, and one about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe. So I'm not unaware of, that it's a problem. I mean, I do think that one of the things I like about Karen Senner, who's this behavioral psychologist I talk about in the book, is that she talks about an authoritarian predisposition, so that it's a tendency that some people have. And she says, really, it can be either left wing or right wing. And so I do think you can find these authoritarian or illiberal predispositions on both sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, there's a great longing for simplicity, which is evident on the right, but perhaps also on parts of the left. A different question, admirable in its brevity, and frankly, the question that I also wanted to ask you. How pessimistic are you about the future of liberal democracy in America, asks Mark Dankoff.
So I don't think you're allowed to be pessimistic. I don't think it's fair to everybody else to be pessimistic. The only path we have forward is to keep trying to improve things and make them better. And I think one of the great mistakes that all of us made over the last, not just the last 20 or 30 years, but really over the last, 100 years, was our assumption that there was something inevitable about democracy, that, we didn't really have to do anything. Our system was the best in the world, and it was just to go on being the best of all systems in the best of all worlds. And we didn't have to try very hard to make it better. We didn't have to work on it. We didn't have to reform it much because everything was, our 18th century constitution would carry us over to the 21st century without any adjustments. And that was a mistake because we can lose democracy. At the same time, I don't want to say that it's inevitable that we'll lose it, or, there are, I can see ways in which it could be renewed. I can see something positive even in the last few months. I can see something positive about the nature of some of the street protests that we saw, the shift in public opinion about racism, and actually even to some extent the shift against Trumpism and the growing understanding of what it is and how dangerous it is. I feel people have woken up to some of the dangers to democracy, and they're more willing to work on it and try and affect change in their lives. I mean, in that sense, the anti-racism movement has something. There is an appeal, about it, that people suddenly see that they want to do something to make it better, to make something positive. I mean, as long as that doesn't turn into a set of rigid rules about what you are and aren't allowed to say, then I think it's very positive. And I end the book on a kind of positive note, saying, look, every generation gets the chance to renew politics and reinvent it. And people who are now in their 20s who don't remember the Cold War and have no, don't even scarcely know what I'm talking about when I talk about 1999. they now have the opportunity to reinvent what America will be in the next generation or the one after. And it's just really not fair to be pessimistic. It's not fair to them. The world is open to them, and they want to do positive things in it. And, I want them to try.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that you're seeing in various societies around the world is that as the values of liberal democracy come under threat and become attacked, people relearn the lessons of why these things are so important. I mean, look, the principles that allow free societies to function aren't particularly inspiring in themselves, right? We care about much more substantive goals, and many of these values seem to be sort of abstract and procedural. And it's only when you actually experience governments and political movements that trample on those principles that we start to recognize why, over a very long period of 300-400 years of trial and error, we have fasted upon those principles precisely because they allow us to protect our societies from some of those clerks and cynical actors that you described so brilliantly in the book. There's a great question here from Karima Benoon. She says that she agrees with the need to promote and preserve complexity. And she asks whether you can talk about the strategies we might be able to use to do that now. How can those of us who want to address human rights everywhere, to afford for multi-directional critiques and to challenge diverse forms of authoritarianism, instead of justifying some because of others, best do so in the current environment?
You were to my ear, you were a little garbled at the end of that. So, but it's about how do we promote complicated conversations, and how do we promote liberal democracy? Was that?
Yes, and how do we stand up against different forms of authoritarianism without starting to justify some because we're scared of others?
So, there are multiple ways. I'm actually writing something now about how to appeal to people who are, in this populist authoritarian bubble, how politicians and others can try and heal this deep polarization that we now have in America, which is very similar to the one that we have in Poland, and resembles really deep divisions in other countries too. But I think the question is more about, ordinary people and how everybody in their daily lives can do it. And I would say, there's a combination of things. One is seeking to reach across the divide wherever you can, and seeking to talk to people who you disagree with. If you're a social media person, which maybe politics and prose people aren't, but but if you're on social media, make sure that you're following people who you disagree with and you understand what their arguments are, and understand and try and reach them and speak to them if you can. If you have people in your family who you have deep disagreements with, it's worth reaching across the divide too. It's really important to join civic organizations. It's really important to be part of things, whether as a volunteer or to work in politics or to, there's so many different ways in which you can participate. I mean, the politics is really only as good as the people who are in it. And the phenomenon that I find so annoying. This is a big problem, by the way, in Poland, is that you hear a lot of people complain about politics. I don't like what they do, or I don't like the kind of people they are. Just, well, okay, so look, it's a democracy. You didn't like it. Do it yourself. Participate. Go to the meeting. Join the party. Become part of the committee. Or run for something yourself. Run for the school board. And so making yourself participate and finding a way to do it. I mean, that's also, if we have more good people in politics, then politics will be better. So that's another thing. I mean, the third thing I'd say, which is a little bit different, is be very wary of modern disinformation and teach yourself how to recognize it. All of us are subject to being, if you read the way we read the news now, I mean, there are few people out there watching who probably still just read the Washington Post every day, and that's great. But if you're online and you're reading news on your phone, or you're getting messages from different places, or you get your news through Facebook, which is where a lot of people do, just become aware of what's a credible source and what isn't. pay attention to what people are, think about who's trying to sell you what and why, because one of the nature of modern media is that it's much harder than it used to be to make even a guess about what's true and what's not. And it's now become this kind of like every citizen's responsibility now to do that and to help other people do it too. I mean, it's, by the way, now something that if you have children, you really have to teach them. Although I do think that younger people have a better sense of this often even than older people. I mean, my kids kind of figured out pretty early on what was disinformation and what wasn't, because they're more native to the internet. But those are the kinds of things I would say. I mean, and then there's a completely separate conversation, as I said, about what are the tactics, what is the language that can be used to persuade people to abandon authoritarian ideas. But I think that's a more political conversation, and I will be writing about it soon.
So finally, I'm gonna completely abuse my privileges to ask the last question here, which is a sort of more global version of a question that one of the members of the audience asked. So, if I have one potential quibble with your excellent book, it's that the title seems to me to be somewhat pessimistic. I mean, the Twilight of Democracy really implies that that the time of democracy is coming to an end, and not just in the United States, but around the world. That this allure for authoritarianism will ultimately seduce us, and democracies will end. I mean, do you think that we will come back to look at this moment in 20 or 40 years as a fake crisis of democracy that we should never have been worried about, as a very real crisis of democracy that we managed to master, and that in retrospect does not look deeper than certain other crises we've gone through? And as some people have pointed out, we do periodically go through these moments when we feel like there is a deep crisis and we despair, and most of the time democracy has sort of pulled through? Or do you really think we're at a turning point where the political system that has dominated the world for 80 years and in certain ways for a few centuries is in its final dimming twilight?
So I'm going to give you a really annoying answer, which is that it depends what happens next. You've just asked me how will we look back on this moment in 30 or 40 years. I mean, it depends what happens over the next 30 or 40 years. I do think this is a profound crisis. I think it is a moment when the political system is being questioned all over the world. I mean, all over the democratic world. It is a moment when the Western alliance, which was I think probably a more important source of stability, even in the United States, and a more important source of stability for democracy around Europe, certainly, is also in crisis. And it's not clear whether it will stay together or whether it's breaking apart. I think we will see the Trump presidency as the highlight and the expression of the crisis. But by the way, if he's reelected, I think that then the crisis will continue and get worse. I can't really deny that that's what I think. But it's also possible that we can, America has come out of crisis. Look, we had a crisis of democracy once before. It was called the Civil War. I mean, that's what it was. A group of some American states no longer wanted to be part of the Union and to obey the rules and be part of the same community as the rest. I mean, that was polarization, in even more profound state. And we did come out of that. We did, we did pull back together again. We did recreate the country, for better or for worse, and we moved on. And we have had other moments when if you think of Franklin Roosevelt, completely changing the way the economy worked in the 1930s. And we've had other moments of big crisis that we have recovered from. So we can recover. It depends on the nature of the next administration. It depends on what happens inside the Republican Party, whether it can reform itself and become once again a conservative party rather than a radical party. It depends on what happens next in this country. And as I said, I feel that it's my obligation to try and be optimistic. I mean, you can look at my book as a warning rather than a conclusion. So I'm not saying it's the end. I'm saying it could be if we're not careful.
And that's certainly, I didn't feel depressed by your book, or I didn't feel despair upon reading a book. I felt energized to make sure that we withstand the allure of authoritarianism and ensure that democracy is not in fact in its twilight. So I think all that remains now is the one thing that really doesn't work over Zoom. I think it's amazing how serious conversations we can have over Zoom, how many people can come and join us in this wonderful conversation. The one thing you can't really do is applaud very effectively, but I hope we're all internally applauding Anne and her wonderful book. And I'll hand back over to the team at Politics and Prose.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And everyone support Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Anne and Yascha. Thank you both so much. We're proud to be your favorite bookstore, Anne, definitely. And we're happy to be the chosen bookstore of everybody this afternoon. Again, that link is in the chat to purchase Twilight of Democracy.
Read the book.
Definitely read the book. You'll also get an email with the link to it later. And this event, should you want to revisit any part of it, is also available on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search Politics and Prose, and this past live stream will come up too. So thank you again, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Yascha. Have a great day, everybody. Stay well and stay well read. Bye. Bye, Anne. Bye, Yascha. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.